Lewis. I'm the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Nonproliferation Initiative. It's good to see you all. We have a special guest today, Ward Wilson. Ward is an independent scholar, and we don't get enough of Ward down in Washington. This is a sort of rare opportunity, and I know we're extremely happy to have him here. I think you'll be hearing a lot more about Ward in the future. Ward is the recent winner of the Doreen and Jim McElvany Nonproliferation Review Essay Contest, which came along with, I think, a nice financial reward. But more importantly, I think significant exposure for Ward's principal line of argumentation as of late, which is I think, an important one, which is, I think, a lot of us naturally assume, and I know I fall into this category, that deterrence as a phenomenon is real and it's successful, and we have some idea how to do that. And Ward's winning essay, Ward's award-winning essay, which is difficult to say, really, I think, challenges that in a pretty profound and fundamental way. And he'll be back in Washington in November for a sort of celebration of his victory and maybe to give that talk. But a central component of his argument is that our one experience with nuclear weapons, the use of those weapons at the end of World War II, has become a kind of myth, that those weapons ended the war, and that therefore there is a certain power to nuclear weapons, and that translates very quickly into deterrence. And in what I think is a very good article in International Security, which you can get a copy of outside, really calls into question some of the historical scholarship that underpins that argument as part of a way of reopening up this question about deterrence. I think that this debate is an extremely important one. I have also distributing an article, which is probably half of the reason we have these talks, is so that we can foist our own work on you, in which I have noted that the sort of debate between those who support maybe more traditional deterrence postures and folks who support, say, a minimum deterrence posture has really turned on this question of whether or not the details of our strategic forces matter, whether the details are incredibly important, or whether it's really the existence of the weapons that matters. And really, at the bottom of that is, I think, a judgment about the power of nuclear weapons and their influence, and those judgments, I think, are informed by understanding of history. And so I think it's an incredibly important discussion, and we are incredibly happy to have Ward Wilson here.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm grateful to be here. I'm always happy to be around Jeffrey. He's always makes me feel as if he is smarter than I am, which I like because I like a challenge. But I want to talk a little bit about two different myths. I'm going to outline some of the arguments about deterrence and go into a little bit more depth about Hiroshima and let's begin with, let's see if we can see any of this. We're not going to be able to make this move, are we? Phaeton, a little Greek boy, went to his mom because all the other boys and asked her why he didn't have a dad. All the other boys in the symposium had a dad, and she said, "Well, your dad is a god." And Phaeton said, "Really?" And she said, "Yes, the sun god Helios." So when he grew up to be a young man, he went to see Helios in his palace, and he said, "Hey, I understand you're my dad." And Helios stepped up to the plate and said, "Yes, I am, and I'll grant you a wish." And Phaeton said, "Great, I want to drive your chariot that runs the sun across the sky." And Helios said, "Well, okay, I said I'd let you do it, so go to it." And Phaeton messes up, the sun falls onto the earth and begins to destroy it. Zeus has to kill him with a lightning bolt. And all of this is just to get you to think a little bit about myths. Myths are unfactual stories that we tell ourselves because they meet some emotional need that we have. There's a difference between myth and fact, and we'll talk about that as we go along. I spent 25 years thinking about nuclear weapons. I was concerned about them for a long time. the first thing that it occurred to me to do was to think up better moral arguments against them. I was sure that if I explained, the people who supported having nuclear weapons were just, didn't understand the moral problems. And if I just explained it properly, then they would get it. Eventually, I had to give up on that line of argumentation and decided to look at all of nuclear theory from the ground up, from a very objective, factual point of view, and try to understand it, rethink it, relearn it. So let's talk about nuclear deterrence for a minute. The first problem that happens, so what you have is a kind of a myth about Hiroshima, that it won the war, and then that informs all the thinking that goes on about deterrence. And the problem with deterrence is a kind of a means and ends problem. People get focused on nuclear weapons. They focus on the big cloud. They focus on the loud noise and the destruction. And they forget about the end result. The second thing I'm going to say about deterrence is that city destruction is largely is a concept or an idea that is at the heart of a lot of what we think about deterrence, either implicitly or explicitly. And I want to talk about the history of city destruction just very briefly, and then myth and fact. So for the deterrence part, that's our guide. Herman Kahn once said, despite the fact that nuclear weapons have already been used twice and the nuclear sword has been rattled many times, one can argue that for all practical purposes, nuclear war is still, and hopefully will remain, so far from our experience that it's difficult to reason from or illustrate arguments by analogies from history. Thus, many of our concepts and doctrines must be based on abstract and analytical considerations. And as usual, Kahn is vivid and interesting and wrong. And I think that the reason is that he has focused on the means, the nuclear weapons. He's allowed them to fill up his gaze, rather than focusing on the ends. The end result is destroyed cities. There have actually been destroyed cities in war throughout 3,000 years of history. So it's possible, actually, if you look at the ends, to do a longitudinal study of the usefulness of destroying cities in war. Does destroying a city help you win? Does it coerce your opponents? Is it effective? I think that city destruction is at the heart of nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence began its life as the first use of nuclear weapons was against cities. McNamara, people often say when I say this, oh, McNamara and the no cities, we don't target cities anymore. There are a bunch of things to say about that. One of them is, by the end of his tenure, McNamara had pretty much renounced the no cities doctrine. The only use of nuclear weapons, of course, has been against cities. Every scenario about nuclear war ends up with a sentence, or most scenarios, that says at the end, and then things might get out of control. Well, getting out of control is using nuclear weapons against civilian populations, against cities. So what that means is that every scenario has within it the potential for cities being an important part of the scenario. It's also not clear that if we had a no cities policy doctrine, that would have effect on other countries. In fact, the Soviet Union had quite a different policy for quite a long time. And there's an argument to be made that in order to be interested in no cities, that you have to have a relatively large arsenal. The U.S. had more than 1,000 nuclear weapons by the time it started talking about no cities. And most of the arsenals in the world are less than 200 weapons. So let's talk about the history of city destruction. This is always what makes people happy and laugh. Attila the Hun why does he have such a terrible reputation? Anyone know? Anybody know what Attila the Hun did that gave him such a terrible? He was a conqueror, but there were a lot of conquerors. He invaded Europe, but there were a lot of people who invaded Europe. It was kind of a hobby in the late Roman antiquity period. What Attila the Hun did was to destroy Aquileia completely. And his reputation is large because city destruction matters. Genghis Khan attacked the Khwarezmian Empire in 1220. The Khwarezmian Empire was Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, parts of Turkmenistan, some others. He destroyed a number of cities, but completely. Killed everyone, by and large. But 3 years in, people were still resisting him. Not every city that he then came to surrendered. So the question is, if destroying cities coerces your opponent or intimidates them, how is it possible to understand this campaign in which Khan destroys city after city, and yet his opponents don't seem to be intimidated if city destruction is so terrifying? In 1631, Tilly destroys Magdeburg. It's kind of the midpoint of the 30 Years' War. He burns the city and kills 30,000 people. And again, it's a pretty complete city devastation. And the question is, if destroying cities ends wars, why did the 30 Years' War go on for another 17 years? Why didn't people surrender? If destroying cities matters militarily. The Japanese, Stalin, Hitler, and Churchill were not coerced by city bombing. None of the participants in World War II surrendered as a result of city bombing. Particularly, I don't think there was ever anyone who stood up in Parliament and said, we have to surrender because they've destroyed Coventry. We have to surrender because they're bombing London. They just didn't talk that way. And this notion that destroying cities is not central to military campaigns is in keeping with the American experience. Sherman burns Atlanta to the ground in 1864, and Richmond is captured late, I think, January of 65. But the South doesn't surrender when Atlanta is burned or Richmond captured. They surrender when Lee and Johnston's armies are surrounded. Cities don't matter. And the reason for this really is that killing civilians is rarely decisive. There were 30,000 casualties in Japan and 570 in Germany and 60,000 in Great Britain. Think about all the wars in history that were won by killing civilians. So here's the step of events. The one side decides they're going to massacre a bunch of civilians, and they do that. And then the other side says, oh my gosh, they're killing civilians. We have to surrender. Name all the wars that you can think of in which that happened. So, well, maybe, Ward, that in those days you could kill some civilians, but with a nuclear war you could kill a really large percentage of civilians, and that would be decisive. But in fact, during the 30 Years' War, 20 to 30% of German civilians were killed, which means that at some point the leaders of the war looked around and said, okay, well, 15% of the population has been wiped out. And then they said, well, but our war aims are still more important than civilian deaths. And then the same thing happened at 20% and 25%, so on. An even more startling example is the Paraguayan War of 1865 to 1870, in which 58% of the civilians were killed. So when people talk about wars and civilians dying and that is going to be decisive, it's not clear based on the historical record how that can be so. There's a lot of history about city destruction and military campaigns that goes counter to that notion. So if you want to claim that nuclear weapons destroying cities is decisive, these are some historical examples that you have to deal with. You have to come up with an explanation why those two things can be so. So while the image of a destroyed city is, arresting, there isn't any evidence. But Ward, what about Hiroshima? I hear you cry. So let's talk about Hiroshima for a minute. It certainly is true that we have all thought that Hiroshima proves that blowing up a city or two will win a war, because it won World War II, right? Okay. Well, let's look at the facts a little more closely. Certainly Truman believed that the bomb won World War II. In a press conference in '46, he says they only surrendered because the bomb was dropped. Stimson believed it too. I'm going to kind of rush along. I'm long-winded, and so we have a lot of ground to cover. There are 4 reasons to doubt that Hiroshima was decisive. The Soviet invasion radically changed the strategic situation, whereas the bombing did not. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just 2 of 68 cities that were bombed. And if you compare the reaction of the Japanese government to the Soviet invasion and to Hiroshima, it's clear that the Soviet invasion touches off a crisis, whereas Hiroshima does not. And last, the Japanese leadership lied to their people and to the Americans. By 1945, it was clear the Japanese had lost the war, and they knew it. Prince Kanoe does a study in February of '45, as early as February of '45, where people talk about the fact that they can't win. They have 2 plans for getting better terms at the end of the war. One is diplomatic, and one is, we're going to look at the guys who are in the different factions. Togo Shigenori, foreign minister. Kido Koichi, he's probably the smartest guy in the cabinet. Yonai Mitsumasa, he's worried that there's going to be an uprising and a socialist revolution. And their plan is to get Joseph Stalin. Remember, the Soviet Union is neutral. They signed a neutrality pact in '41 to mediate. This is in keeping with their experience during the Russo-Japanese War in 1902. Which was ended by mediation by Teddy Roosevelt. The hardline faction, Anami Korichika, he's really the main guy in the government, Umezu Yoshijiro, and Toyoda Soaimu. He's a tough character. You read his transcripts of his interviews. Their plan was to fight a decisive battle, build up defenses on the beaches, and when the Americans landed, inflict such heavy casualties that the U.S. would be willing to offer better terms. So let's just review. In the summer of '45, they had 2 options, battle and mediation, and either one of them would have worked, could potentially have worked. Neither one of them were great options, but they were realistic enough that you could imagine that they might work. After Hiroshima, it's still possible to ask Stalin to mediate. He can still be a mediator for you. Fighting a decisive battle is still possible, and in fact, they're still planning on a decisive battle after Hiroshima, in the days after Hiroshima. So you still have 2 strategic options after the bomb is dropped. What happens after the Soviets invade on August 9th? You can't ask Stalin to mediate, of course. He's a belligerent in the conflict. Let's just review the strategic situation real quickly. The U.S. is going to invade Kyushu, the southernmost island, with 14 divisions. The Soviet Union launches its invasion into Manchuria with 1.4 million men. They have a 5-to-1 superiority in tanks. They slice up the Kwangtung army. The 16th Army, 100,000 strong, moves into the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and their mission in the next week after taking Sakhalin Island is to invade Hokkaido from the west. Hokkaido, most of the Japanese forces have been moved south to prepare for the American invasion. Hokkaido is understaffed with 2 divisions. The 5th Area Army is understrength with 2 divisions and 2 brigades. So even for someone who doesn't know very much about military affairs, it's pretty clear you can't fight one giant power attacking from the south and another one from the north. So once the Soviets invade, a decisive battle isn't a possibility. They're out of strategic options. There's nothing they can do. Let's talk about city bombing. We knew the bomb was special. We spent $2 billion on it. We had all of our top scientists working on it. There was a lot of portentous feeling about it early on. But from the Japanese perspective, it's not clear that you would necessarily notice a single drop of rain in the midst of a rainstorm. The United States in 1945 bombed 68 cities in Japan. They killed 320,000, estimated 320,000 people, wounded 472,000. They made 8 million people homeless and destroyed 177 square miles of urban space. They were attacking cities as small as 30,000. They attacked so many cities that they started with the biggest and worked down to the smallest. They were attacking cities of 30,000 or less, which, to give you a sense, that's a large town in most developed countries. To give you a sense, if you took the Rose Bowl and had everyone from that town sit in it, it would be a third full. So these are small towns. We've bombed every city in Japan. The average B-29 bomber could carry 8 to 10 tons of bombs. An average raid is 500 bombers. So the average conventional raid was dropping 4 to 5 kilotons of weapons on a city. So, this is a graph of all the different city attacks, all 68 of them, and the number of people killed in each attack. And when we think about where Hiroshima is, we imagine that it's because we've been told that it's the most horrible attack ever in history. In fact, Hiroshima is second. Tokyo is first in terms of number of people killed. If we look at the square miles destroyed, again, we might imagine that Hiroshima would be way off the charts. In fact, it's fourth in terms of square miles destroyed. 3 conventional attacks destroyed more square miles. And finally, if we look at the percent of city destroyed, what you find is that Hiroshima is 17th in terms of the percentage of the city that was wiped out in these attacks. So actually, Anami says on the 13th that the atomic bomb seemed no more menacing than the fire bombings that Japan had already experienced. So from the Japanese perspective, it's not clear that this makes a great, large impression, at least to the war leaders. Let's imagine that we are the Supreme Council of Japan for a moment. Maybe the cabinet. The council was only 6 people. And every morning we wake up and we get reports about what cities have been bombed. Here it is, July 16th, and you can see that 4 cities were bombed. Actually, it's the morning of the 17th. 4 cities were bombed last night. Numazu was the worst. It was more than 80% destroyed. This is 20, 40, 60, 80. So 3 mornings later, and now we wake up and 4 more cities have been bombed, and 2 of them more than 60% destroyed, and Fukui is more than 80%, 83, 84% destroyed. And we go to bed, and it's a week later, and now 3 more cities have been destroyed. Matsuyama is in the 70s. 2 days later, 6 cities are destroyed, including Ichinomiya, which is almost, that must be about 76%. 3-4 nights after that, Toyama is 99.5% destroyed. In terms of percentage, it's the worst city attack in the summer, that summer. August 5th, 4 days later, we get another report. Imabari has been almost 80% destroyed. And now on August 6th, finally, Hiroshima, and it's 68.5% destroyed, which means that in the 3 weeks prior to Hiroshima, 8 of the 26 cities that were attacked were as completely destroyed or more completely destroyed in terms of percentage as Hiroshima. Now, some of these are smaller cities, so there's, in actual terms, there's a little less destruction. But we tend to think of cities as unitary. A city is a city is a city. We don't always think of them in precise terms. So you can't see this very well. Here's a little picture of some city destruction. You can see there's a lot of area that's been flattened. Some concrete reinforced buildings are still standing. You can see back in here, there are whole blocks that have been just destroyed. There's a block here that has 1 building left in it. And again here, the bridge is still standing, and some trees, but basically Now, the thing about the 6 pictures that I just showed you is that 3 of them are of conventional bombing, and 3 of them are of nuclear bombing. Hiroshima, Tokyo, 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 Hiroshima, Hiroshima. So the question is, if you can't tell the difference between this bombing and that, between conventional and nuclear bombing, why is it that we imagine that Japanese leadership was able to immediately understand the difference? Let's quickly look at some of their reactions, and this is where the most interesting stuff comes. It's August 15, and at 8:15, Hiroshima's bombed. They get first fragmentary reports start to come in by 8:30. And they get reports all day from various military units and headquarters around the country. The next morning, there's a report that comes over the radio. Truman has said it's an atomic bomb. He announced it the day before. It took a day to get it transmitted and translated and so on. Togo, the foreign minister, says to Suzuki, let's have a meeting of the Supreme Council. This is important. We need to talk about this. And Suzuki checks with the military guys and he says, no, let's not meet. Some of the military guys are kind of busy. They can't free up their schedules. Not that big. Now, at midnight on August 8th, or 12:01, the Soviets invade Manchuria. Within about, 4 hours, 4.5 hours, word starts to trickle into Tokyo. Early word gets the military guys first. Other word gets the civilians later. At 10:30, the Supreme Council is meeting to discuss surrender terms. They're deadlocked. During that meeting, then they go to a cabinet meeting, which is a larger group, and they get word of Nagasaki. So what this means is that from the destruction of Hiroshima until they begin to discuss surrender is 74 hours. Whereas, by contrast, the distance between the Soviet invasion and the first meeting of the Supreme Council to discuss surrender is 6 hours. So it raises the question, which is the proximate cause? JFK was in bed on October 16th at about 8:30 when McGeorge Bundy brought him word that the Russians were putting missiles in Cuba. And within 2 hours and 45 minutes, they'd selected a committee, brought them to the White House, had them seated around the table, and they were having a meeting. Harry Truman, on June 25th, when the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel, was in Independence, Missouri on vacation. Atchison calls him at home on Saturday, and within 24 hours, Truman is at Blair House meeting with his top advisors, military and civilian advisors. George Brinton McClellan, of whom Lincoln said sadly, he's got the slows. When a sergeant in one of his units found a full and complete set of Lee's invasion orders for the invasion of Maryland wrapped around 3 cigars, we never find out what happened to the cigars. He wasted only 12 hours. The slow guy wasted only 12 hours before lurching into slow motion action. So the question that we have to ask is, if Hiroshima touches off a crisis, what is this 3-day gap? How do we explain this 3-day delay? Doesn't it seem much more likely that this event was the one that touched off the discussion of surrender? Let's look side by side at one guy. There's a couple, but I only had time. It's actually Kwabe Toroshiro. He's the deputy chief of staff of the Army. He's kind of a cheerleader type. He's always saying, let's go, hooray. So he writes in his diary on August 8th that when he heard about Hiroshima, so this is 2 days later, after it happens on the 6th, on the night of the 8th, he writes in his diary, when I heard about Hiroshima, it gave me a serious jolt. And he uses shigeki, which is serious jolt. He doesn't say shogeki, which is shock. And he writes, but he goes on and says, but we must be tenacious and fight on. By contrast, when the Soviets invade, he immediately goes to Army headquarters and draws up orders declaring martial law, which are implemented that day. And in the meeting of military only to discuss the implications of the events of the day, he suggests that they overthrow the government, take the emperor hostage, and declare a military dictatorship. So the question is, which is a more serious, which seems like a crisis? Jolt? Or declare martial law, overthrow the government? Okay. In its official policy meetings, the Supreme Council said Soviet entry would determine the fate of the empire, and Kwabe, who always has to, do a little bit more and be a little more enthusiastic, says the absolute maintenance of peace in our relations with the Soviet Union is one of the fundamental conditions for continuation of the war. So the Soviet Union mattered, and they knew it. They said it as a policy matter. On the other hand, city bombing is only mentioned twice in the Supreme Council, once on the night when they're discussing surrender by Suzuki offhand, and once in May, 5 months earlier. It's very difficult on the evidence to argue that city bombing mattered to the Japanese leadership. So, Koichi Kido says, if military leaders could convince themselves they were defeated by the power of science, but not by lack of spiritual power or strategic errors, they could save face to some extent. And Sakamizu, who's the cabinet secretary, says, in ending the war, the idea was to put the responsibility for the defeat on the atomic bomb alone and not on the military. This was a clever pretext. So, put yourself in Hirohito's shoes. You've just been through a disastrous war. You've lost 300,000 people and 8 million are homeless and the country's devastated. What are you going to say? Well, we weren't very smart. We made some stupid decisions and we, weren't very brave. Or are you going to say, the enemy made this amazing scientific breakthrough that no one could have expected, and that's why we lost? From the American perspective, it makes sense to embrace the notion that the bomb won the war, because if the bomb won the war, the U.S. gets the credit for winning the war, and our diplomatic influence is enhanced, and the perception of our military power is enhanced. But on the other hand, if the Soviet Union invasion was the crucial factor, then the Soviets get the credit, and their diplomatic influence is enhanced, and the perception of their military power is enhanced. So even today, there are reasons why it would be difficult for people to say, well, the Soviets were the key factor. So it's pretty clear that the Japanese surrendered because the Soviets invaded, they took away their strategic options. They weren't that concerned about having their cities bombed, whether that's good or bad, or, it's the same attitude Churchill had, so it shouldn't shock us. So what does that mean? Briefly. Oh, this is long. There are two kinds of technology. This is the Assyrian Empire. It's largely built on having iron weapons, which no one else had. They built this huge empire. Genghis Khan conquered the largest empire in the history of the world based on technology. He had reflex bows. They had special bows where they were made from multiple layers. They could shoot farther and better. But consider chariots, just for a minute. It's a little digression, but it's kind of amusing. Chariots come out of just north of the Aral Sea in about 2000 BC. They spread across the entire Eurasian landmass in the next 1,400 years. They are ubiquitous. Everyone wants to have them. They are a conspicuous mark of wealth. Really rich nations have got to buy them. They show a high level of technological achievement, and they're terrifying. Most of the armies are conscript peasants and who don't even know horses, and to see them thundering towards them, they're frightening. But consider, you're in a chariot. There are two horses in front of you. Horses are this wide. Two of them are this wide. You're standing in a basket back here. Let's say you have a spear or sword, and you want to reach somebody. You go riding up to them, you've got to reach way out here if you want to be able to have any impact on them. The second problem is that if you drive a spear through a guy, if he's bigger and fatter than you are, the tendency will be for him to stay where he is and for you to go out the back of the chariot, which is a significant problem if you've never been thrown out of a chariot speeding along at high speed. Which is why most charioteers were armed with bows. But there's a problem with bows. two-handed weapons. And as you'll see, this fellow actually has the reins tied around his waist, which means he's out of control while he's in a fighting mode. He can't steer the chariot. These are all significant drawbacks. Finally, if you remember being a kid and taking a ride in a wagon, that red wagon that had just wheels and axles, no suspension, you will remember that at high speeds, the slightest bump can throw the wagon and you into the air. The same is true of chariots. I think it was Gaugamela where Alexander and Darius stop, and they wait a day so their guys can go out and clear the plains and make them flat and smooth so the chariots can be used, because otherwise they can't be. So chariots have all these drawbacks. They're terrifying and impressive, but it's not clear that they're really all that useful. They have almost no practical military value. And so there are two kinds of technology in the world. There's crucial technology, like the iron weapons of the Assyrians or the bows of the Mongols. But there's also technology that is impressive, terrifying, expensive, but not necessarily all that useful. Does that ring a bell? All right. All right, we did that slide already. Let's skip most of this stuff. This is boring. All right, we'll do the Paris gun, but then we'll skip chemical and nuclear weapons. Paris gun, World War I, they had this big gun. It was on rails. It was fired shells at Paris. Fired shells 80 miles. It was terrifying. Parisians, suddenly a shell would fall out of the sky. People were killed. They fired it from the spring of 1918 until August, I think. But you don't see nations rushing to build superguns. You don't find African nations spending their diamond and oil wealth on superguns. You don't have diatribes in liberal papers about people building superguns. And you might say, well, of course, Ward. It wasn't very effective. And that's really, I think, the central thing to keep in mind about nuclear weapons. The important question about nuclear weapons is not, are they horrible? It's not, are they big? The question is, are they effective? Do they work? What are they good for? What can you do with them? In this connection, it's interesting to think about chemical and biological weapons. They've both been banned. They're both relatively difficult to use to win a war with. They had extensive experience with chemical weapons in World War I, and they didn't lead to any particular strategic advantage. It's even more obvious that there are problems with biological weapons. It's difficult to aim. You can't contain it to a specific area. It might spread back to your own troops. It's a nightmare. And so the question is not, it's not about them being horrible. It's about them being useful. And I think the same question is the question we should ask about nuclear weapons. So now we really are in the home stretch. Nuclear weapons are too big and they leave poison wherever you use them. Big problem. There's a notion that people have that bigger is always better, that if you have a knife, that it's always better to have a pistol than a knife. And if you have a pistol, it's always better to have a howitzer than a pistol. And if you have a howitzer, it's always better to have a nuclear weapon than any of those. The fact is, weapons are situational. Like any tool, you need the right tool in the situation that you're in. If you're underwater, a howitzer is a less than ideal weapon. If you have to maintain silence, a pistol is less effective than a knife, and so on. I think that sometimes people imagine that there is this relationship between utility and power. The more powerful a weapon is, the more useful it is, hands down. In fact, it seems to me that our experience is beginning to show that it's more like a bell curve, that weapons are more powerful, the more useful, the more powerful they are, but that at some point their usefulness begins to tail off, that they become too big to be useful. Guys who watch football will know this from offensive linemen. Offensive linemen, there's an ideal size. You can't just get the biggest guy you can get. because after a certain size, they're too big to be useful. I think the same is true of weapons. There is an ideal. The notion that the size is a problem is reinforced by the fact that warheads have been shrinking. If the largeness of nuclear weapons was really the characteristic that made them useful, then they would be getting larger, because largeness is what makes them powerful. But in fact, they've been getting smaller. What does that say? And we're going to look at targets. You know, you drop them, they're just too big. You've got a little tiny target, and even with something larger like a supply depot, it's still, the weapon is, a city is a good size. There's a good match between the size of a nuclear weapon and a city. The question is, do you want to destroy cities? Even when you're using them on the battlefield and you have spread out, and you can, you know, get a bunch of different units at once, you still have the poison issue. They spread this contamination downwind that can spread back to your own troops. So that makes the battlefield messy, and it's a problem. You know, and the guys, there are measures you can take, but the guys, they're wearing these big suits. It makes them much less capable. They can't see, they can't breathe. Even for strategic applications where you're attacking targets deep in the other country's homeland, the poison, the radiation makes it difficult. Here, this is the famous von Hippel-Drell limited attack just on silos and a couple of submarine bases, and you end up killing 110 million people because the radiation blows downwind, and Chicago and Minneapolis and so on get badly. Okay. So the defense of the United States is vitally important, and we can't depend on that for weapons that don't work. Are nuclear weapons tremendously destructive? Yes. Can they kill millions of civilians? Without a doubt. Are they well suited for the battlefield? No. Can they win wars if targeted against cities? It's unlikely. Are they a certain and effective way of coercing our opponents or prospective aggressors? It's not clear. Their value to us is questionable. The danger in the hands of our enemies is substantial. And the danger in the hands of terrorists is very high. If nuclear weapons are of doubtful benefit to us and a significant danger in the hands of our adversaries, isn't the U.S. better off in a world free of nuclear weapons? Thank you.
All right, well, we'll take a few questions sitting here. Catherine, how long do we have the room till? Another half an hour. Okay, great. I'm going to ask people to, you know what you can do?
What? Put this, oh, that's great. I feel much better.
All right. If you could identify yourself, and Rudy, did I see your hand up?
Oh, you did. Thank you.
I'm going to stand up so we both have a mic.
Okay, that's great. I'm just going to talk really loudly.
Oh, thanks. I'm Rudy Barnes with the House Armed Services Committee, Strategic Forces Subcommittee. And part observation and question one, I find remarkable parallels between some of your conclusions about the utility of nuclear weapons and deterrence and the way we think about it, and the way some folks who are generally construed as being at another end of the spectrum from you, Keith Payne comes to mind, who's reaching similar conclusions about how we think about deterrence. I think of General Cartwright when I heard you talking about the utility of these weapons, and he's very transparent in saying they're not very useful, so give me other things, because I don't really want to use nuclear weapons. But my question is, are you concerned that in the number of years it might take to get to a radically smaller number or to zero, and there's not a lot of people that I'm aware of arguing that we wouldn't be better off in a world free of nuclear weapons. I think the argument becomes about how can we get there, and things of that nature. But in the intervening years, between now and then, are you worried that you are creating a stronger argument for low-yield weapons? Having proved, at least intellectually and for the moment to me, that, you know, and noting as you did that the yields have come down for various reasons. So that would be the question.
Yeah, I think that realistically, when you say that destroying cities doesn't get you much, that you are encouraging, that you do put some support behind smaller yield weapons, but you know, the taboo against nuclear use is still relatively robust, and so and the fact is, from my point of view, I don't see a way to argue against nuclear weapons except on the usefulness necessity approach. I don't know how to. I mean, people tried for 60 years to say they were immoral and horrible, and you know, there are lots of immoral and horrible weapons. The ones that have gotten banned are the ones that aren't useful. So it seems to me. So there's some pressure for there's some encouragement for smaller yield weapons in this sort of argument, but I don't see any other arguments that you can use to get there. So I don't know what to do about that.
In the back.
Howard Moreland. About back back in the 1980s, I was working on Capitol Hill and trying to make the argument that you just made. In fact, I went all over the country speaking at college campuses and Freeze campaign chapter meetings and that sort of thing. And it was a continual frustration to see that people like Richard Pearl and NHTSA and, you know, this pantheon of nuclear priests were always in power and always had the megaphone. And those of us who were trying to make the opposite argument were always in church basements and completely, you know, on the fringe of society. It seems to me we were right, you were right, these guys were wrong and are wrong. How come they always win?
Well, I'll tell you a secret theory I have. Nobody tell, okay? I met Max Kampman, and he was strong-arming me about various things.
You know we're recording this, right?
And he said, you know, Reagan was not as bad a guy as a lot of people say. And I had always had a very negative, you know, I won't say what I used to say about Reagan. But I went back and I read some of the things that Kampman had written, and it seemed to me that actually Reagan was kind of sly and smart in some ways, particularly excellent on nuclear weapons. Obviously, he's the only guy who's ever come close to abolishing them. And it's what my sense is, and this is just a made-up guess, that the nuclear freeze movement, although it was always publicly opposed by Reagan, because he was a relatively savvy politician, that in fact that widespread, broad-based movement gave him the cover and the impetus he needed to do Reykjavik. He knew he could promote Reykjavik because there was already these people marching in the streets. And so I think that that if we get to a point where we have nuclear prohibition, that what you're going to need is exactly that kind of coalition. You're going to need a broad base of regular people and some leadership, and you're going to have to outflank a certain group of experts who are always going to say, you know, we need my expertise. So I don't know if that's really an answer, but it's kind of.
Yeah, I'm Helena Carbon. I'm with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. I'm just climbing out of the church basement. I blog at Just World News. I've been doing a lot of thinking about strategic questions recently, and I'm coming to the conclusion that foreign wars are asymptotic to unwinnable because of the transparency of the global information environment. I mean, we're not in the 19th century anymore. You can't just like send in the US cavalry and, you know, or the British Army or the Indian Army and, you know, wipe out whole peoples without everybody at home and elsewhere knowing about it in the way that you could in the 19th century. And, I mean, Iraq and Israel's campaign in Lebanon seem to really underline this point, which has to do with the end of the theory of shock and awe, of which perhaps, you know, Hiroshima is held up as a central example, the seminal example of the enemy having been shocked and awed into surrender although they were going to surrender. Anyway, it was just a question of the terms of the surrender they were discussing. But when I've discussed this with various people, they say, oh, well, what you're talking about is just conventional foreign wars are unwinnable. So that strengthens the argument for nuclear weapons. So that's why I'm really glad to hear what you are arguing, because I think our arguments are complementary in important ways, and we can discuss that more later. But I don't think you've quite proved the case just by demolishing the Hiroshima precedent. And you know, a lot of nuclear deterrence is not reliant on the Hiroshima argument. Could you speak to that?
I could for a long time, but you guys don't want to stay.
I do.
Well, you're very nice. The essay that I wrote, it's a 10,000-word essay, and it's called The Myth of Nuclear Deterrence. And I just lightly, I mean, there's already too much in the presentation. So I just lightly touched on some of the stuff that gets discussed in it. But it focuses on that same notion that destroying cities doesn't win wars. And what nuclear weapons do best is destroy cities. So, but I think they are complementary arguments.
Honor de Borgraf, CSIS. I'd like to take you back to your conclusion about the Japanese and the Soviet invasion, the Soviets joining the war against Japan. I was alive for 3/4 of the last century. In fact, at the time of Hiroshima, I'd already completed 3 years in the Navy. And I've been to Japan countless times since then, especially since the Korean War. And in all the discussions we've had in strategic discussions, it's always been Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of course that Russia entered the war was part of the thinking, but certainly not decisive in the decision for the unconditional surrender.
Well, I think that's the prevailing view, and it's what everyone hears, what gets taught in American schools, what gets discussed in most journals. Historians have been quietly rewriting the history, and I think there's also a certain difference of opinion around the world. For instance, the British official history of World War II of the Pacific Campaign states that the Soviet invasion was the reason why the Japanese surrendered. Sumio Hatano, I hope I have his name right, I'm trying to remember, is one of the leading Japanese scholars. He edited the large compendium of primary documents that came out in Japan, and he says that in Japan the judgment at the moment is 50-50. Half the Japanese scholars think it was the Soviet invasion, and half think it was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And certainly for a long time in the U.S., it was everyone just said, okay, it was Hiroshima. But I think that that as more information comes out, that there is a shift, and that if you look at the 3-day gap, and if you look at these different contradictions, it raises questions. So, I understand that people. I was talking to a friend of mine who's from Russia, and she said, of course the Soviet invasion won the war. They teach us that in grade school. So I think there's different perspectives around the world.
My name is Linda Gunter. I'm with Beyond Nuclear. My father, who started Scientists Against Nuclear Arms many years ago, wrote a lot about the myth of nuclear deterrence. And one of the issues he posited, I wondered what you thought of this, was that he said if a weapon is only useful if you never use it, which is the fundamental premise of deterrence, is that if we all have such dangerous weapons, no one will ever use them against us because we've got them as well. So if a weapon is only useful if you never use it, is it actually a weapon? Should we redefine the meaning of the word weapon?
And I think that gets to a fundamental misconception that practically everyone has, and that I had myself until 4 months ago. And that is this confusion about the difference between a weapon that is dangerous and a weapon that's useful. And here's the thing that I finally came up with to think about this problem. Imagine you had nitroglycerin in a bottle, and your spouse came home and said, honey, I've got nitroglycerin in a bottle. They sold it to me at the hardware store. It's great. We'll use it to prevent burglaries. We'll hang it on a string here in the kitchen, and no burglars will ever burglarize our house. And you look at your spouse and say, okay. And then you tiptoe around very cautiously in the kitchen, because if you knock that bottle of nitroglycerin, you know, it's goodbye kitchen, you, kids, pets. In a lot of ways, and then say your spouse comes home and says, I bought more nitroglycerin. We can use it to persuade the neighbors not to put their grass clippings on our yard. And the question is that nitroglycerin, A, does it really prevent burglaries? Was there anyone who was actually going to burglarize your house before you hung the nitroglycerin on a string? Just the fact that you creep around and are nervous and fearful doesn't prove that the weapon is effective. So just because US and Soviet leaders were cautious and careful all throughout the Cold War, that proves that nuclear weapons are dangerous. It doesn't prove that they're useful. It proves that they are the nitroglycerin on the string. If you knock them over, it's a big mess. It doesn't prove that deterrence works, for instance. So I think that that's a fundamental distinction that we all have to make. Danger versus useful. They're clearly dangerous, and they can kill a lot of people, no question.
Al Richmond, former State Department. Let me take the liberty of two short questions. One on the Hiroshima-Nagasaki timeline. I had the impression that Nagasaki reinforced Hiroshima. I'd like to know what in terms of the Soviet entrance into the war and the Japanese decision to make peace, how Nagasaki entered that question. The second is, what are the implications for what you're saying for our dealing with Iran?
Yikes. Nagasaki, if you're going to argue that nuclear weapons are the reason why the Japanese surrendered, Nagasaki is your best argument. What you want to do is shape the argument this way. You say they bombed Hiroshima, and then they didn't know what had happened, so there was this delay. And then Nagasaki happens, and that confirms for them that the weapons are powerful and that the US has a lot, and then they decide to surrender. That's your best case if you want to argue for the usefulness of nuclear weapons. The problem is that the facts aren't really in your corner. The announcement of Nagasaki comes during a cabinet meeting. They talk about it in the open cabinet meeting. The cabinet is deadlocked at the time when the announcement comes, and it remains deadlocked. So it has no practical effect. So now you have to argue that Nagasaki was the key, except that no one reacted at the moment. It only was the key because it changed them inside where you couldn't see and they didn't say. And there's another problem with, God, I was just writing this. There's another problem with Nagasaki, and the other thing is they don't say very much about Nagasaki in the meeting. They don't act as if, they don't slap their foreheads and say, this is a crisis. They essentially say, okay, well, they blew up another city. They've been blowing up cities all summer. So, you know, if Nagasaki came before the decision to have a meeting to surrender, that would be maybe some evidence. But the Soviets invade and they decide it's a crisis and they race around Tokyo and they have meetings about overthrowing the emperor and they declare martial law and it's a crisis, you can tell. And within 6 hours they're sitting at the table. And Nagasaki is just, you know, by the by. It just doesn't have that kind of impact. It's hard to show on the facts. It's hard to build a factual case for Nagasaki. But if you want to believe in nuclear weapons, that's what you got to hold on to, because that's your best argument. And Iran. I don't know what to say about Iran. I'll tell you what I think about Iran. I think that the Iranians would never put themselves in a position where someone launched a full-scale nuclear attack against them. I know that the administration believes that they're terrorists and that they are fanatics and they're religious who believe they're going to heaven and all this stuff. And maybe that's true to some extent. But the fact is that Iran has for a long time been the vessel, the keeping place, the sacred spot of the Shia religion. From their point of view, it is the one true religion. And if you are the keepers of the flame, if you are the holders of the one true faith, you don't risk having your entire faithful group be wiped out so that the world is left only with Sunnis. You would never do that. You wouldn't, no matter what you might gain from dropping a bomb on Israel, you wouldn't risk destroying the one true faith, from my perspective.
Benjamin Borgeson. I'm a grad student here in DC, and this question might touch on some of the questions that have already been asked, but if I'm understanding the key assumption behind your argument correctly, it is that city destruction is prominent in nuclear deterrence because we assume that it is a decisive event that can win wars. But isn't it more correct to argue that city destruction has a role in nuclear planning, not because we think it can decisively end wars, but because it is horrifying and awful and terrible, and we assume and we hope and we pray that any rational actor would not risk it? And doesn't this kind of have the unintended effect of reinforcing a counterforce doctrine until the world is rid of nuclear weapons?
It certainly, this notion certainly has a lot more in common with the old Soviet doctrine about nuclear weapons, which treated them as, very pragmatically and said they're weapons, we'll use them to fight wars. We're not horrified by city destruction, it is what it is. I mean, they had a much more matter-of-fact kind of attitude toward it. I guess something else I was going to tell you, but I can't remember what it was. So I think that city destruction, I don't remember. I don't have anything smart to say about that. I think that you do tend to reinforce the notion of counterforce, except that the notion of nuclear war is kind of silly. Well, I remember what I was going to say. In the paper, there's a section on nuclear deterrence as terrorism. There's a lot of similarities between using nuclear weapons and between what terrorists do. Terrorists kill civilians in order to coerce politically. And in the classic nuclear attack, you blow up a city in order to coerce people. So there's some parallels. There's an interesting article by Max Abrams in International Security. He talks about whether terrorism works, and he does a study. And what he finds is that terrorism works about 7% of the time. But what's interesting is that target selection is the key variable. Of the terrorist groups that target police and government officials and army bases and so on, those are all the ones that succeed. That's the 7%. Of the ones that primarily target civilians, none are successful. And he postulates that when you use terrorism against civilians, what you do is, there's a social theory, Fritz Heider is the guy, I don't know, that attribution, that even no matter what your opponent says to you about why he's attacking, when he attacks civilians, you read that as an attempt to exterminate your whole society. And it seems to me that that probably has some applicability to nuclear war, that it's not possible to signal with nuclear weapons. You can't lob one weapon over and send a signal because you've destroyed one city but not 30. Because as soon as you have the first attack, people will say, you're trying to annihilate us. This is the first in what must inevitably be a series of extermination attacks. And then, of course, when you're fighting someone who's trying to exterminate you, you never surrender. Because there's no point in surrendering, because they're going to try and exterminate you anyway. So I think it's an interesting question, and there's some stuff I talk about.
We have two more questions, and we will take them, but I want to pick up on that last point, because I want to use that to try to make the case for deterrence, all right, which is to say that I agree with you that if Attila or Tamerlane or, pick your road from history is at the gates of your city, and he says, surrender, or we're going to raise your city to the ground, kill everybody. You have the natural problem of wondering that, if you surrender, will he do that anyway, right? I mean, you don't have a guarantee, and nuclear weapons are a little different, and people often forget this. A very famous person on my committee who's famous for saying, that deterrence is the power to hurt. And everybody leaves off the second part of it, which is you also have to have a credible promise to not hurt if the person you're coercing complies.
Thomas Schelling.
So, right. So the point is, the point is that with the case in Japan, right, where the Japanese are, I mean, I agree with your analysis, right? I mean, they're willing to bear this level of pain to begin with because they have this end game strategy, and with guys on horseback raising cities, you don't know that. But in this particular case, perhaps for a very small number of missions, say core deterrence, right? Like say you are the Chinese or the Pakistanis, don't you get some benefit from being able to have these dangerous things if you have this credible promise not to use them?
Well, that's really interesting. And as usual, you've managed to make me feel like I'm not as smart as you are. And
it's because I'm used to being around people a lot smarter than I am. I steal their mannerisms. But
I don't know. I'd love to talk to you about it.
I just, I mean, we're all kicking around the nuclear weapons, which is good because they deserve it. But
let me say back to you what I think you said, and then you can tell me why I'm wrong. You said that it has to do with the promise not to. There has to be a credible promise not to destroy you, and that if you have that, then
then doesn't that put you in a position where instead of forcing the person to bear the pain, right, and hope it's the pain that makes them capitulate, if it's the opportunity to choose to forego it in the first place, doesn't that give you a deterrent effect? Doesn't that, to some extent?
You're manipulating the ability to not give them
I'm
pain.
objecting to the nitroglycerin example.
I love the nitroglycerin.
I'm not sure I do yet, but
Okay, all right, okay. Well, we'll talk about it.
we can talk about it
All right.
afterwards. So we had two more questions, and
Yeah.
then we're out of time.
Cheko Kitagawa Science, originally from Hiroshima. Assuming, two questions, one comment. Assuming that your theory of it's a Soviet invasion, breaking of neutrality rather than atomic bomb, which ended the war. But isn't that the timing of Soviet breaking on the neutrality, influenced by the atomic bomb's presence on the use of it? If that is true, isn't that theory really, a false part? That's the first question. The second question is...
Wait, I don't understand. The timing of the Soviet...
The Soviets
Yes.
invaded because we dropped the bomb, because they wanted to get in on
Oh,
Or,
good, good.
even without dropping a bomb, being notified that you have the atomic bomb with the intention to use it. And that actually influenced the timing of the end of the war. Then does your theory stand? That. And the second is, that this kind of political meaning of or political value of the nuclear weapon. Deterrence is a big issue, but right now, the issue is more of the proliferation, and it's not whether the weapon is effective or not, but the concept, the perception that it has a political value. How does your theory try to fight against this perception? And the last is rather comment. I think that listening to the people here, outside of Japan, the understanding of what nuclear weapon is really the impact you described is not really well known. And the one of the things which prevented the knowledge, widespread of knowledge, is that the United States doesn't want to accept the criminality of using that, and how how against the morality or the humanity that usage words.
Okay.
Ward,
Thank
let's
you.
just take the last question,
Okay.
and you can sort of do the big wrap up.
Shoot.
Well, I was going to let you answer her. I was
No,
gonna
go
let you
ahead, go ahead. We'll do a big
But I was going
sweep
to start
in.
with, in terms of your nitroglycerin argument,
Yeah.
going back to my favorite movie, the greatest movie of all time, the whole point of a doomsday device is to tell people that you have it. Now, we can have this argument.
Gentlemen, please, there'll be no fighting. This is the war room. I'm sorry.
We can have this whole argument because we're a democracy. The British can have this argument because they're a democracy, the French, and so on. But if you look at the bulk of our wars, all of our wars since, in recent years, we have a gradual push towards precision-guided weapons further and further, further and further. If you look at our excursions, they're all non-nuclear countries. When you come to the Pakistans of the world, the North Koreans, the Chinese, they are all nuclear countries, and we tend to shy away from trying to bring them to the table and go more diplomatically. And if the Russians, who by the way, up until through the Cold War into the 1990s, still had chemical and biological weapons.
I'm getting a little lost in the digressions. Where I'm just having trouble following. Can you?
Okay. Well, my point was, if you look at the Chinese and the Russians, and the lessons from Kosovo up through Iraq, is that precision-guided weapons, we can, that's their biggest fear. Iran, and then we move towards Pakistan, Iran, even India, even India. Nuclear deterrence works for them because we simply don't attack, and that might be a reason for Iran to want the nuclear bomb, because they look at their neighbor Pakistan, they look at the Indians further over, they look at the North Koreans. Nuclear deterrence works for them, keeping us at arm's length, just like the Russians and Chinese have been able to do throughout the Cold War. That's my final point.
Okay. All right. So, the timing of the Soviet invasion. Yes, it appears that Stalin was impressed with nuclear weapons. And it appears that the invasion date was moved forward, the Soviet invasion date was moved forward because of what he was told about the U.S. and using nuclear weapons. Does that invalidate the theory? I don't think so. I think it's possible to be afraid of nuclear weapons if you're Stalin, and for the weapons still not to be effective. So it's certainly true that they had an impact on Stalin's decision making. Was he all that impressed with them? It's not clear. Certainly when the U.S. had a monopoly of nuclear weapons, the Russians didn't shrivel up and go home. They negotiated they blockaded Berlin and all these different things. The political value of nuclear weapons. I wrote a thing about a great warrior who killed a lot of people, and then he died. And he always used to wear this mask in battle. And everyone said, oh gosh, he's dead, we're really in trouble. And then a very bright girl stood up who had been reading, I think, the Iliad, and said, why don't we just send out somebody else with his mask on? Because it's his mask that scares people, and then we'll be able to maintain our position because we'll have the same military might that we always had. The thing about relying on nuclear weapons and focusing on the political value rather than the practical military value is that at some point you may face the music. There may be a real test. And if you've been going along imagining that the political value is what's important, and then it turns out that the practical value of using them is put to the test, suddenly someone attacks the soldier in the mask, and it turns out he's not a great fighter like the real guy in the mask was. So I think it's very dangerous to rely on the political power of nuclear weapons, because if that political power is based on a myth, that they're really secretly, militarily very powerful. And the last thing is the morality question. The problem with Hiroshima is that people think it's an argument about whether or not the United States is good or bad. They think it's an argument about, was the U.S. bad for bombing Hiroshima? And I'm perfectly willing to have a moral discussion with you if you like. But what I'm interested in is not whether the U.S. is good or bad. I like the U.S. I'm happy about the U.S. What I'm interested in is, are the weapons effective? Do they win wars? Because it seems to me that everything else flows from that.
Okay, let me clarify that point.
Okay.
What I
There will
wanted
be
to say was
lots
that-
of opportunities, though, to clarify in the
Since the-
afterwards.
since the
We're just
government-
gonna keep going, huh?
Sorry, since the government.
Well, no, you're not. You're keeping
want to
going.
Recognize the war criminality. You said it's democracy, but your government hid the evidence of the brutality of the weapon from the public.
Let me say this about morality. The problem with talking about morality is it brings up a lot of passion. People care about it a lot, and it makes a lot of people mad. Different sides.
I don't know.
I'm just saying in general. I'm not saying you're mad.
About the fact.
My point of view is, if city bombing is wrong, it's wrong no matter what you use to do it. Nuclear weapons, fire bombs, artillery shells, pots with Greek fire that you catapult over the walls. City bombing is wrong, it's wrong. The ends matter, not the means. So I'm perfectly willing to say that bombing Hiroshima was wrong, because I'm also willing to say that bombing Tokyo was wrong, and bombing Hamburg was wrong, and bombing London was wrong, and bombing Coventry was wrong. So I think that the morality problem is a constant impediment to this larger and I think more important question of, if the bombs don't work, it doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong, because we can get rid of them. And that's really what we want to do, it seems to me, is to prohibit the weapons. And if that means that we don't get to make the moral points that we wanted to, I'm willing to do that.
I think that's a nice place to leave it.